Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Biblical Reflections, our Monday night class, focusing on the stories of the book of Genesis and trying to delve into these stories to see what lessons the Torah could possibly be teaching us in our day-to-day lives. We are in the middle. We just began last week the story of the binding of Isaac. I'll give a brief summary of what we have discussed thus far, and we're going to get right into it. One of the most complex dramatic stories of the Bible. Before I do, just a quick announcement. This Sunday, we're going to have Dennis Prager speaking for us at 5 p.m. on Jewish values. You can go to jewishacademy.com to sign up for that. There is no fee, but we do ask that you make reservations in advance. That's 5 p.m. this Sunday, Dennis Prager on Jewish values. It's going to be shown on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Jewish Academy. So one of the most difficult stories to comprehend is the story of the binding of Isaac. And what we're going to try to do here is understand it, analyze it, and try to understand what is its purpose and its teaching to us. As I said last week, towards the end of class, I asked you the question, especially for those that are teachers, why you test your students, because we call the binding of Isaac one of the 10 tests and the final of the 10 tests of God testing Abraham to see indeed that his faith was strong. And so what is the purpose of a test? Why does a teacher give a test? And we discussed teachers give students tests for various reasons. One is to see how each student is progressing, what they're understanding, what they're comprehending, and what they're not comprehending. It's for the teacher to assess the effectiveness of the instruction. Is the way they're teaching, are the students catching on? Are the students lost? It's to challenge the student to study more and to, we cram before a test, before an exam, and so we intensify our studies. It motivates the students and to be able to compare the students to see which students may need more attention. And so if we use the word test when it comes to Abraham and God tested Abraham, we're left with a fundamental question, and it's a big question. If God knows all, if God is infinite, if God knows Abraham, if God knows the future, why test him? If you know the grade that he's going to get, then you know exactly the effectiveness, you know everything about him that you need to know. So if God knew before that Abraham would say yes, and that Abraham would wake up early in the morning, and Abraham would travel to the mountain that God showed him, and Abraham would put his son on the mount, on the altar to offer him as a sacrifice. If you knew all that because you were infinite, why put this man, this sweet man, this kind man, through the strain and the stress and the pain of having to travel for 3 days thinking that he's going to say goodbye to the son that he loves so much? And so that must be understood for us. And perhaps we have a better understanding by looking at the biblical word as the Torah word for what is English, in the English language translated to test. In the Hebrew, the word is nisayon. And nisayon comes from the word nes. Nes means a banner, a pole, something that you see from a distance. It's like a flag. It's for people to see the flag, something that's visible and recognized from afar. So the test here for Abraham really is not a test God needed to know if his faith was strong or not. It's not for God's sake. It's not for God to know. God knew. And I mentioned last week that there is a very, very powerful few verses, some of the most, I would say, warmest, emotional, inspiring verses of the book of Genesis has God talking to himself. And it's very rare that you have God talking to himself and publishing what he said to himself. And yet you have that in this particular chapter of the Bible. You see, when you communicate, think for a moment, when you're communicating, and we as human beings, we communicate in various ways. We communicate through action. We do something, people notice that we did it, and that's a means of communication. But primarily when I say communicate, you're thinking speech. I choose words to say. So at this very instant, when I'm thinking that I want to pass on a message to you, my mind is working. It's selecting words, because English is my first language. Unfortunately, my father wanted Yiddish to be, but he spoke to me only in Yiddish and I answered in English. So because I am more fluent in English, my brain is filtering what I want to say into words, into English words, and I am delivering these words through the power of speech that God gave me. And I'm delivering them now to you. I'm passing on this message to you through words. I'm communicating. But there's another communication system, and the other communication system is how I communicate to myself. I'm not using words, I'm thinking. I may think in words because that's the way my mind is used to working, but I'm no longer filtering it so that you understand. I'm now just talking to myself. When I communicate with myself, I'm in the highest form of communication because I don't have to select words for you. I'm now just thinking to myself. So when the Torah tells us God was thinking to himself, and this is what he's thinking, understand that it's giving us really some really heavy, high-level understanding of what is going on within God. And the story is taking place when God decides that he's going to wipe out the cities of Sodom because of their wickedness. He then says, shall I conceal from Abraham that which I'm about to do? Again, he's talking to himself. Shall I conceal from him? I'm not going to tell Abraham that I'm about to do this. And then he explains the question, how can I not tell Abraham? And he tells the audience that he was thinking to himself at the time, and Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. And I know him, and I know that he's going to command his children and his household after him. And I know that his children are going to keep the way of God, and they're going to do charity, and they're going to do justice. And God's going to bring upon Abraham all that which he promised him. Wow. It's a powerful statement. God is saying about Abraham, this is the man. I know it. Now, if God's saying, I know, he knows the future. He's infinite. He knows. And he says, I know not just about him. I know about his descendants. In those verses, God's speaking about us too. And he's saying, I know they're going to fulfill this job. They're going to fulfill this mission. They're going to bring blessings to all the families of the face of the earth. So if God is talking to himself and God is saying to himself, I know Abraham, he uses that terminology, I know him through and through, then you knew his faith. And you knew very clearly that if you're going to ask him to any type of challenge of faith, that he's going to pass it. The students of the Bible already knew that God knows the faith of Abraham to be absolute. So why put him through this? And the answer is that the test is not for God's knowledge. It's not for God's benefit. This was for Abraham's benefit, as I'll explain this evening. This is for our benefit, as I'll explain this evening. This is for the world's benefit. You see, we each have potentials built into us, potentials that if we don't ever actualize, we will never know that they're potential. And the only way we actually know that we have this gift and we have this skill and we have this ability is when it's put into motion. And I gave you different examples last week. There are individuals that perhaps have great skill and talent in drawing, but unless they go and they try to paint a picture, they'll never know they have it. They can have skill in music or in sports, but unless you actually go on the court and throw the basketball and see if you can get it in the hoop, you'll never know if you could have been the next Michael Jordan. Now, obviously, you got to be 7 feet tall as well, but put that aside. Skills are something that we may have within potential, but if we never actualize it, we don't know how great we can possibly be. The mission of Abraham is the most important, most difficult mission that God ever gave to mankind on this earth in the history of the world. And in order for this mission to succeed, and that is to influence an entire world, he needed to have brought out from potential to actual tremendous strength, tremendous faith, tremendous conviction, confidence, character, and only then could he and his descendants be successful. Each of the trials of faith that Abraham went through was all about developing another dimension of Abraham's relationship with God, building particular talents and skills and faith levels that Abraham would need to pass on to the next generation and next generation and next generation until today. When Abraham is going through these tests, God knew he was going to pass it. Abraham didn't know he was going to pass it. When Abraham does, he now knows, check, I have this within me as well. I can do this. I can do that. Now, it may not be as important to Abraham as much as it's going to be important to his descendants, because unfortunately, his descendants are going to go through extremely difficult periods of history. There's going to be some rough waves along the way. There's going to be some hurricanes along the way. There's going to be some storms along the way. And we need to have the stamina, and we need to have the amunah, the faith, and the betachon, the trust in God. And we got it from Abraham. We received it from Abraham. We know it's within us because we're the descendants of Abraham. So now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through, perhaps at a rapid pace, all 10 tests of Abraham, the 10 tests that Abraham went through in his life, culminating in the 10th and final test, the binding of Isaac. So, put your seatbelts on. We're going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. Test number 1 was when King Nimrod threatened to kill Abraham by throwing him into a furnace, because Abraham refuses to bow to his idols. Nimrod claimed that he was God and that his idols were God and you needed to bow. Abraham refuses to bow, and Abraham is threatened, if you do not bow, I'm throwing you into a furnace. Abraham says, go for it. He's thrown into a furnace, a miracle of miracles, he's able to survive. Nothing happens to him. Abraham, at this very young age, prefers to die rather than betray his belief in the creator of the universe. Now, this test takes place very early in the life of Abraham. It's noteworthy that the early challenges take place before there's even any communication between God and Abraham. It's purely on faith that Abraham believes that there's a God. And he comes to this realization that there are things worth dying for, that life without certain ideals is not living at all. And for a Jew, for a descendant of Abraham, life without God, life without faith, denies life its meaning. Test number 2. Abraham is asked to leave his land, his family, and his friends to wander in a strange land. We've spoken a great deal about that particular verse. When Abraham is 75 years old, he's told he's got to start all over again in a new environment, a new place. The importance of Abraham leaving and starting a new life, a new nation would emerge from this. This trial taught Abraham that to have a close relationship with God, to have a unique relationship with God, you must be prepared to leave behind your comfort zone, the natural tendencies, the habits, the preconceived perceptions. He may have to be a stranger in a strange land, but it's the relationship with God that he seeks more than anything else. Test number 3. Abraham trusts God, and he ventures on this unspecified journey, right, to the place that I will show you, and it culminates in his arrival to the land of Canaan. As soon as he arrives in the land of Canaan, we discussed this a few weeks ago, a famine breaks out in the land. Before he even has a chance to settle, he's forced to wander to another land. So this is God saying, go to this land, the land that I will show you. I'm going to bless you, bring you blessings. He comes there and there's a famine in the land. Everyone go find food. He's got to go down to Egypt to find food. There is this expectation that when you're on the mission of God, everything is going to go smoothly, that there won't be any obstacles. There won't be any struggles, only goodness and kindness from all of your encounters. Think about it. We would expect as Jews, since God took us to Sinai and he made us his people, we are his chosen people. He gave us 613 commandments. He told us to be a light unto the nations. He told us to be a priest to the world, right? At least you would say he would take good care of us. He would spare us the aggravation of having to provide for our families. We wouldn't have to make a living. We are priests, right? We're supported by the people. So God should deposit, just like the government is doing these days with the stimulus checks. You wake up in the morning, they put money in your bank. I'm mechaya. It's wonderful, right? We would think if you want to be God's chosen people, every week there's a check from God put into our bank. We work for you, God, right? We're the chosen people, a light unto the nations. We got work to do. Deposit the check every week. I don't have to worry about anything. All I have to worry about is being a light unto the nations. That's what we would expect. Surprise, surprise. It doesn't work that way. When you enter the land, God says, and you plant your fields, make sure you give charity. Make sure you leave the corners of the field over. What do you mean? We're plowing fields. I thought we're the chosen people. God made it very clear that I want you to be a chosen people, but you're still going to be part of the world. And if you thought that the world is going to fall in love with you because you're on God's mission, think again. How we react when things don't go as planned. Do we drop the mission, or do we have faith that this too is part of the mission? This strength we got from Abraham. Test number 4. He comes to Egypt to get food, and Pharaoh abducts Sarah. So Abraham has to go to Egypt. He finds food. His wife is taken by Pharaoh. And as we explained a few weeks ago, Maaseh Avo Simon Labanim, later his descendants will be exiled in Egypt by Pharaoh, and they will leave, just like Sarah was released with many gifts and many presents, so too the Jewish people, after 210 years of exile, will leave Egypt with these many gifts. Test number 5. He hears that his nephew Lot was captured. There was a war between nations, literally a world war on that particular period of time. And his nephew was captured, and he's faced with the choice of risking his life by going to a war where he's vastly outnumbered against a powerful, powerful group of kings and their armies, or leaving his nephew to his fate. Lot, who we learned did not wish to follow in the teachings of Abraham, still brought about this compassion from his uncle, and Abraham is off to war to rescue his nephew. Test number 6. In a vision, God shows him, reveals to him the exiles that his descendants would go through and the persecutions of his descendants. He's shown that these difficulties are not just for him personally, but they're going to be part of Jewish history. He's shown the suffering of the Jewish people, but he's also shown the glory days. He sees tomorrow. He sees the days of Mashiach, and so he knows it's all worth it. But nevertheless, for a compassionate Zaidi to know that his children will suffer was extremely difficult for him. And yet he doesn't challenge God. Test number 7. God commands Abraham to circumcise himself when he's 99 years old. Abraham doesn't say, what will the neighbor say? So long as the man is all about sharing and caring and hospitality and worship of a creator, he can sell kindness, but try marketing circumcision. That's not something easy for him to sell. And yet, he doesn't ask questions. If this is what God wants, this is what he's going to do. Test number 8 was another king, Abimelech abducts Sarah. Similar story again, and it's here we go again. Again, she's abducted by a king. Again, God will intervene. Nothing will happen to Sarah other than putting Abraham through the pain of having his wife taken prisoner for a while and then ultimately released. Test number 9, I need you to pay close attention to, because I'm going to come back to test number 9 when we start really delving into test number 10. So if you were dozing off a little bit as we were racing 1 to 8, wake up, test number 9. Abraham and Sarah do not have any children at this point in the story. Sarah had a maid. Her name was Hagar. So she reasons Sarah, why should Abraham go through life childless? After all, he's supposed to be the father of a new nation who God has already promised will inherit the land of Israel and change the whole world. And thus far, there's no children. So how could these promises ever come to be if there are no children? So she comes up with the surrogate mother plan. She tells Abraham, marry my maid. And if she gives birth, I'll raise the child together with her. Abraham listens to his wife. And indeed, Hagar gets pregnant. And the moment she gets pregnant, she stops seeing herself as the maid of Sarah and starts looking at herself as the wife of Abraham that's more worthy than Sarah. You've been married all these decades with him. You never had a child. I'm married just a short period of time and I'm already pregnant. So I must be righteous and you're not so righteous. That's the way she starts looking down at Sarah. And conflict breaks out between the two, between Sarah and Hagar. And it got so bad that Hagar runs away from the home. And she is met by an angel. And she's told, go back. Live under Sarah. It's the place to be. Respect her. She deserves that respect. And the angel also promises that the son that will be born will multiply greatly, and yet will always be involved in conflict. It'll be a great nation, but always involved in conflict. So she listens to the angel, and she goes back to Abraham, and she gives birth to a son. You know the son. His name, Ishmael. Fast forward. 13 years later, Abraham is promised by God that he and Sarah would give birth to a son. Now, when Abraham hears this, he's troubled, and he says to God, Lu Yishmael yichya lefonecha. Oh, that Ishmael would walk before you. Meaning, Abraham knew that Ishmael was not growing up as he was supposed to. And he believed that the reason God was promising him another son was because this one struck out. God didn't like this one. And therefore, we got to do this again, but this time we're going to bring you a son from Sarah. Now, he's obviously thrilled that his barren wife, Sarah, miraculously is going to have a child in her old age. But in the meantime, right now, he's feeling pain that Ishmael did not grow up as he should, that he has a problem teenager here. And so God reassures him that this is all part of the plan. It was always supposed to be this way. Sarah was always destined to have a child. Following me so far? Now let's jump a year later. Sarah gives birth to a miraculous child at the age of 90 years old. Abraham is 100 years old. They name the child Isaac. Isaac means laughter. So now there's two children in the home, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac is the younger one. Ishmael is the older. The children are growing up, and Sarah sees how Ishmael is a wild, wild boy, and he's a bad influence on the young Isaac. And she knows that Isaac has to become the next patriarch of this nation, that he's the one that's going to inherit the mission of Abraham. That's been told to them. And she tells Abraham it's time for them to go. Hagar and Ishmael need to leave this house. All along, I did this because I thought I wasn't going to have any children. But now that we have Isaac and we know Isaac is the one, and Ishmael is not growing up as he should, and he's a bad influence on this son that we really need to protect, it's time for them to go. I want them to leave. Abraham is very pained by this request. He loves his son. It's his son. So God intervenes. And God says to Abraham, be not distressed over the youth or your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you to do, listen to her voice. Whatever she says, she knows what she's talking about. Since it is Isaac that will be your offspring, he needs that protection that Sarah wants to provide. But as for the son, Ishmael, I promise you, Abraham, I will also make him into a strong nation since he's your offspring. You don't have to fear. Ishmael will still grow into a very powerful, eternal nation that will be on for all of history. They will be there. I want you to remember the story because I'm going to come back to the story. But that was challenge test number 9. Now let's get to number 10, the binding of Isaac. So you already know Isaac is born, right? He's now 37 years old. So those that have this image of Isaac being this little boy, a 5-year-old, it's not true. He was 37 years old at the time of the story of the binding of Isaac. The Torah tells us after these events, God tests Abraham. And he calls out Abraham. And Abraham answers, Hineni, here I am. And God says this, please, kachna, please take, es bincha, your son, es yechidcha, your only son, asher ahavta, the son that you love, es Yitzchak, take Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah, go on a trip, a road trip, and I want you to bring him up as a burnt offering on that mountain that I will designate to you. Vayashkim Avram Baboker, how does Abraham respond to God coming to him and telling him to take your son, your only son, the son that you love, take Isaac, and go to Mount Moriah and bring him there as an offering on the mountain that I will show you? What is Abraham's first response in the Torah? Vayashkem Avram Baboker, he gets up early in the morning. Vayachavosh es chamoro, he saddles his donkey, and he's on the road. The binding of Isaac, this story, is not only a pivotal part of Abraham's life, but it's a significant event for all of Jewish history, affecting the lives of each and every Jew, for every generation. This riveting, suspenseful account is repeated in our prayers every single day. It is read in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. It is referred to over and over by all of our sages as the event that best demonstrates the ultimate faith, the ultimate trust, and the self-sacrifice, the Mesiras Nefesh of the Jew. What we want to understand tonight and next week, and perhaps carried on to our last class of the winter semester before the Passover break, will be, why is the binding of Isaac given such prominence over all other biblical stories of the patriarchs? As I've been mentioning, the binding of Isaac was the 10th and final test of faith in Abraham's life. After the binding of Isaac, for the remaining 38 years of his life, he was never tested again, because he had already reached the ultimate heights that any human being can climb. So let me throw out 4 questions for you. One we have already thrown out, 3 additional ones. 1, why was this test considered more difficult than any of the prior 9 tests that Abraham experienced? Question 2, why is it called a test for Abraham? Why isn't it a test for Isaac? After all, Isaac was the one to be sacrificed. And don't say he didn't know what was happening. As I'll show you, he knew good and well what was going on. And he wasn't this little baby that couldn't fight back. He was 37 years old. He was stronger than his father. He could have very easily said, no, I'm not doing this, Dad. You need to see a doctor, Dad. You don't do these types of things. Instead, Isaac goes along with it. So why isn't it the test of faith of Isaac? Why only a test of faith of Abraham? Number 3, why do we repeat it so often? Why every single day do we have to repeat this story? We heard the story once. Once a year is good. Every day we have to repeat the story. And question 4, the question we started with. Was God not already convinced of Abraham's faith before the binding of Isaac? Didn't Abraham already prove his total faith, his Mesirat Nefesh, his self-sacrifice for God? Didn't God already know the outcome, and thus why put Abraham through the pain and through the anguish? And we started briefly answering that question earlier tonight, and we'll come back to it. The more we look into the binding of Isaac, the more we begin to see that this is a story that has many dimensions to it. It's not a single dimensional story. It builds, it has layers and layers and layers. And thus it becomes the most unique of the biblical stories of the lives of the patriarchs. So I ask you to join me in mind now as I build my dimensions with you, the dimensions of this particular story, the binding of Isaac. Dimension number one, Abraham waited for 100 years for the birth of a child with Sarah. 100 years. As the verse says, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son, and you shall call him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him and with his descendants after him. Okay. A great miracle occurs for Abraham and Sarah. A son, Isaac, is born in their old age. A son that will be the heir to Abraham and will inherit the mission. And that's very clear from the text of the Bible. It will be him and not Ishmael. This is the son that will inherit the land of Israel. It will be passed on to his descendants. It is he that will carry on the blessings that was said to Abraham. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. All of that is now being passed on to this miracle child, to Isaac. After Isaac is born, Abraham and Sarah have no other children. They have one miracle child together. That's Isaac. And the text of the Bible already tells us that all the blessings of Abraham and the mission of Abraham has been passed on to this one and only son, Isaac. Everything now rests on his shoulders. If there's going to be a continuation of this new nation that will continuously keep the world in existence so that it doesn't fall into the days of Noah like, the responsibility of being the blessing to the world, bringing blessing to the world, is all on Isaac's shoulders. Keep this in mind. At the time of the story of the binding of Isaac, Isaac is a bachelor. He is not married, and he has no children. For 37 years, Isaac is raised and educated by Abraham and Sarah. And as I told you, in protection, which means they're protecting him from any influences because it all falls on his shoulders. He is the future. And it's clear again from the text of the Bible that Isaac was growing up to be a worthy successor of Abraham. He was taking it all in, and he was a fitting successor as the next patriarch of the Jewish people. Everything seems to be fine. Everything seems to be fitting into place until God comes to Abraham and says, please take your son, your only son, the one you love, take Isaac and travel to the land of Moriah and bring him up as an offering on the mountain that I will show you. With that one statement, doubt and confusion is brought on the very future of a Jewish people. How would it continue? 1 second. If Isaac is slaughtered, who leads the next generation? You already disqualified Ishmael. You made it clear, God, not Ishmael. Isaac has no children. Abraham and Sarah didn't have any more children. It's only him. So suppose we take the verse at face value, bring him as an offering. And suppose Abraham, we know he didn't, but suppose at that time when God is giving the instruction, Abraham would have carried it out. Who would lead this new nation? These people responsible, this nation responsible to be a light unto the nation. If there would be no Isaac, would the passing of Abraham then mark the end of the mission? Did it fail? Let's build on this. Furthermore, Abraham had built up a following by now. He's known. He's very popular. Remember, I pointed out for weeks now that he's not Noah. He gets out there. He talks with people. He invites people in. He encourages belief. He encourages faith. He encourages monotheism. He encourages kindness. At this point in his life, he has a large following in all nations. They all know of this man. People know of him. They learn from him. They love him. He's very popular. He has many followers. He's teaching all the time. He's a leader, and he gains respect wherever he goes. What were his teachings? What was the fundamental teaching of Abraham? That people should emulate God. What kind of God? Not the gods that you worship, not the idols that you worship. No. God that hates cruelty, God that loves kindness. Abraham spoke out against a generation that believed in the worshiping of idols and performing human sacrifices before these idols. How can you serve these idols with human sacrifices? If you really believed in God and God's a God of kindness, God would not want a human sacrifice. That's the teaching of Abraham. What would happen to all of his followers if indeed he carried out the instructions of God and actually slaughtered his son? They would hear that Abraham violated the very teaching that he so strongly preached against. His entire life's work would be nullified. It would be wasted. He would be ridiculed by the entire world. The belief in God as one moral voice in the world that he, Abraham, worked so hard to teach would have been discredited, perhaps for good. You follow me on this? It's not just bring your son. It's everything Abraham represented. It's everything Abraham believed in that's being challenged over here. The human being can withstand much pain in life, but the most difficult struggle of all is disgrace. Disgrace. People can't handle it. When charges are brought against someone for charges that are humiliating to someone, they put them on suicide watch. Why? Because the human being can handle a lot of pain, can't handle disgrace. We don't do good with disgrace. Abraham must have known that upon his return from the mountain, if he carried out the mission of God and slaughtered his own son, that disgrace awaited him. Disgrace for Abraham, disgrace for his teachings, and worst of all, a mockery of the God he worked so hard to introduce to society. That's the challenge of this particular test. And yet for Abraham, there was no doubt, there was no confusion, there was no hesitation. He was asked by God to perform a mitzvah, a deed that God asked him to do. And his love and his awe for God and his desire to fulfill God's command was all that Abraham could think about. Nothing else mattered to him. If this is what God wants, no, I do not comprehend it. I have questions from A to Z. But this is what God has asked me to do. And so I will do. I will follow what God asks. That's just one dimension. Let's build on it. We'll do dimension number 2 tonight, and then I hope you're going to be able to remember where we left off so that next week we can get right into dimension number 3. Verse after verse, in the early portions of the introduction of Abraham to us, the audience of the Bible, tells us about the promises and blessings that God gave to Abraham concerning his descendants, right? Whether you studied every text from the Bible or you heard the stories of Abraham, you are clearly familiar that God gives promises and blessings to Abraham. And they're all concerning his descendants. They're going to be like the stars in heaven. You've heard those expressions, like the sand on the seashore, right? You've heard these blessings. It would only be natural for Abraham to wonder, what will be with all those promises? The promises that God gave, if indeed I carried out the sacrifice. Certainly a simple question from Abraham, saying to God, but what about, and you finish the sentence, what about my descendants will be like the stars in heaven? What about my descendants will be a light unto the nations? What about my descendants will bring blessings to all the families of the face of the earth? Isaac is the only descendant I have. I'm 137 years old now. Simply just saying, God, I will do whatever you ask, but I just want to have a better grasp. I want to have a better understanding. If you, God, infinite God, made a promise, many promises concerning my future, concerning my descendants, concerning the mission of my descendants, and now that will come to an end because the same infinite God is now asking me to bring it to an end. There's a conflict. They're contradicting one another. And yet, silence from Abraham. Total obedience. The only response the Torah tells us, he woke up early in the morning and he saddled his donkey. No questions asked. Onwards to Eretz HaMoriah, onwards to the land of Moriah to find this mountain that God wants me to fulfill this commandment. Abraham understands that listening to God, even if the command is beyond any comprehension whatsoever, is the ultimate in serving God. And he will hold nothing back. Not his son, not his reputation, not his students, not his lifetime of achievement. It did not matter to Abraham that no one would understand him, so long as he was fulfilling the will of God. That's dimension number 2. We have a long way to go, so please stay with me. Be back Monday night at 7:30. We'll continue with the binding of Isaac. You're all welcome to join me Wednesdays at 12:30 as we go through the book of Deuteronomy, studying Moses' final speech to the Jewish people. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Take care.